The fluorescent lights of the corner store buzz overhead as Olivia Mercer scans the shelves for something quick to eat after a 12-hour shift at Mercy General. Her scrubs still carry the faint smell of antiseptic, and her feet ache with that bone-deep exhaustion only pediatric nurses understand. She reaches for a pre-made sandwich when the bell above the door chimes. 3 men burst inside. Ski masks, guns. The world tilts sideways into a nightmare she has seen on the news but never imagined living through. The lead man shouts for everyone on the ground, and her knees hit the dirty linoleum before her brain fully processes the command. There are maybe 6 other people in the store. An elderly man near the register, a teenager by the drinks, a woman holding a baby. The baby. He is crying now. High-pitched wails of terror that pierce through the shouting. The woman holding him is shaking so violently Olivia can see it from 10 feet away. One of the robbers waves his gun at her and screams for the noise to stop. The woman looks around wildly, her eyes locking onto Olivia's. She stumbles forward, her eyes darting to the glass windows, not with fear of the robbers, but of something outside in the dark. Suddenly, the baby is thrust into Olivia's arms, heavy, warm, and screaming. They are close, the woman hisses, her voice like broken shards of terror. Save him, don't let them take him back. Then, as if making herself a decoy, the woman bolts for the back exit, drawing the chaos away from the child before Olivia can say a word. The weight of this child settles against her chest, and every instinct she has honed over 6 years of nursing kicks in. She curls around him automatically, making her body a shield. A gunshot cracks through the air. The store owner crumples. Blood spreads across the floor in a dark pool. Olivia presses the baby's face into her shoulder and hums, a tuneless, desperate sound meant to soothe him, or maybe herself. His cries soften to hiccuping sobs. She notices things in fragments. His clothing is expensive, soft cotton with a designer label visible at the collar. The blanket wrapped around him is hand-knitted, pale blue with white stars, clearly made with love. There is a birthmark on his neck, a small port wine stain shaped like a crescent moon. He can't be more than 5 months old. Sirens wail in the distance, growing louder. The robbers panic. They grab the cash and run, leaving chaos behind. Olivia stays on the floor holding the stranger's child until police flood inside. The woman never comes back, and Olivia does not know that somewhere in Chicago, a man whose name makes this city tremble is searching for the baby in her arms. A man who has buried his sister 3 weeks ago and torn apart half the underworld looking for his nephew. A man named Dominic Corsetti. When he finds her, nothing will ever be the same. If you are listening to this and feel that the story touches something quiet and unspoken inside you, take a moment to subscribe to our channel, to like and share this video, so we can continue bringing heartfelt stories every single day. And if it is not too much to ask, tell me where you are watching from, and leave a comment below so we know which corner of the world this story has reached, because we treasure every word you share with us. A police officer helped Olivia to her feet, and her legs shook as if her bones had turned to jelly. She gave her statement in broken fragments while the baby still clung to the fabric of her scrubs with tiny fists. They asked about the woman who had been holding the baby, and Olivia tried to remember, only to realize she barely recalled anything useful. Brown hair, average height, panic in her eyes. Nothing memorable, nothing distinctive. Just a desperate woman who had shoved a child into the arms of a stranger and disappeared into the night. The detectives took notes, nodded, and exchanged looks with one another in a way that made Olivia understand they didn't really expect to find that woman. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. The woman didn't come back. The paramedics worked over the shop owner, but from the way they moved, Olivia knew it was already too late. She had seen death often enough in the hospital to recognize the moment hope slipped out of a room. A social worker arrived after that, a woman in middle age with gray hair and tired but gentle eyes. She stepped forward and held out her hands for the baby. Olivia had known this moment would come. She knew the protocol. The baby would be taken into the system. There would be someone to care for her, somewhere for her to sleep. But the instant the social worker touched her, the baby screamed. It was not an ordinary cry, but a raw, ripping shriek of terror, as if someone were trying to tear her away from the only lifeline she had left. The baby buried her face in Olivia's chest, tiny fingers clutching at the fabric so fiercely that Olivia could feel the small nails scraping her skin through the thin cotton. Olivia heard her own voice speaking without any plan at all. "Not yet," she said. "Not right now. Let her calm down first." The social worker paused and looked at her with a measuring gaze. Olivia drew in a deep breath and began to explain. She was a pediatric nurse at Mercy General, 6 years of experience, all her certifications and licenses in order. She could care for the baby through the night, could serve as an emergency foster caregiver until the mother was found, or a more suitable placement could be arranged. She didn't know why she was saying these things, didn't understand why this fierce protective instinct was rising in her for a child she had never met before. But when she looked down at the tiny face pressed into her shoulder, eyes swollen from crying and now slowly calming in her arms, Olivia knew she could not let her go. The paperwork dragged on for another hour, and by the time Olivia stepped out of the police station, with the baby dozing in a borrowed car seat, every part of her body felt ready to collapse. She called Mia from the back of a taxi and tried to explain that she was bringing home a baby, a real baby, and her friend's shock echoed through the phone in a cascade of questions Olivia could not fully answer. All she could say was that she could not abandon the child, could not let her vanish into the foster care system alone and afraid. Not when she had clung to Olivia, as if Olivia were the only safe place left in the world. In the dimness of the taxi gliding through the Chicago streets at night, Olivia looked down at the sleeping baby, and a memory rose without invitation. Lily, the only foster sister she had ever truly loved across 8 foster families. Lily with golden hair and a smile that made the dark, cold world of the group home feel a little less bleak. Lily lying in a hospital bed at 16, skin pale from leukemia, fingers wrapped around Olivia's hand as she whispered that Olivia should not cry, that everything would be all right, but everything had not been all right. Lily had died because the family had no money for treatment, because the system had failed, because no one cared enough to save an orphan child who meant nothing to the world. At that small, unattended funeral, Olivia had sworn to herself that she would never let another child face that kind of loneliness again. And now, 11 years later, she was holding a stranger's baby in a taxi at midnight, with no idea what she was doing and only one thing she knew for sure: she could not abandon her, whatever that might cost. The apartment looked smaller than it ever had when Olivia stepped inside with the car seat hooked over her arm and a bag of donated supplies from the pediatric emergency department swinging from her shoulder. Mia stood in the kitchen, her eyes so wide that Olivia could see the white all around the irises, her mouth opening and closing and opening again like a fish flung onto dry land. "She is so beautiful," Mia whispered at last when she finally found her voice, and Olivia felt that familiar surge of protectiveness rise once more as she set the car seat down on their battered old sofa. Mia didn't ask too many more questions. Instead, she grabbed her wallet and car keys and said she would run to the store for formula and diapers, because clearly whatever the hospital had donated would not last long. The door closed behind her, and Olivia was alone with the baby in the quiet apartment. The only sounds the ticking of the wall clock and the steady breathing of the sleeping child. Gently, she lifted the baby from the car seat and carried her into the small bedroom, laying her in the middle of the bed and building a ring of pillows around her for safety. Then she began to do what 6 years of training and practice had turned into instinct. She examined the baby with the meticulous care of a pediatric nurse, her hands light but precise. The heartbeat was steady and strong. The lungs were clear. There was no hint of fever or infection. But when she undressed the child from the expensive clothes to look more closely, Olivia's heart tightened. The baby was thinner than she should have been at 5 months, ribs faintly visible beneath the soft skin, muscles not as developed as they ought to be. There were traces of old diaper rash, partially healed but clearly left untreated for too long. Her nails were longer than was safe for an infant, with grime caught beneath them. These were the signs Olivia had been trained to recognize, the marks of neglect that was not deliberate cruelty but the kind that came from chaos, from running, from never having enough time or resources to care properly. Someone had loved this child. The delicate hand-knit blanket proved that, but that same someone had been unable to protect her as she deserved. Olivia bathed the baby in the bathroom sink because the apartment had no proper tub, the warm water and gentle hands making the child squirm but not cry. She dressed her in one of the donated outfits, a simple white onesie without any designer label, but clean and soft. The baby watched her through the entire process, large eyes tracking every movement as if Olivia were the center of the universe, as if she were the only thing that made sense in a chaotic world. When Mia returned with 2 bags full of supplies, they mixed the formula together, Olivia showing her friend how to test the temperature against the inside of her wrist. The baby drank with the hungry urgency of a child who had not been fed on time in far too long, the sounds of her swallowing loud in the small, quiet room. After she was full, she burped and settled against Olivia's chest, one tiny hand curling around her finger as if afraid that if she let go, Olivia would disappear the way everything else had in her short life. Mia finally went to bed after hugging Olivia and promising she was there if anything was needed. The apartment sank into darkness and silence, the only light the glow from the street lamp slipping through the curtains and painting soft bands of gold across the ceiling. Olivia sat propped against the headboard with the baby sleeping on her chest, warm and steady in her breathing. She looked down at that small face in the dark, the features soft and perfect in the peace of sleep, and asked herself what she thought she was doing. Who was she to bring home a stranger's child? A child who might have family searching for her, who might belong to a life completely different from this cramped apartment and 12-hour shifts and a bank account that was always close to empty. But when the baby stirred in her sleep and instinctively turned her face toward Olivia's warmth, when those tiny fingers tightened around her own as if even in dreams she feared being left behind, Olivia understood. She understood why she had not been able to let the child go, why her heart had decided long before her mind could catch up, because she knew what that feeling was like. The feeling of being passed from hand to hand, of never belonging anywhere, of being someone's burden instead of someone's joy. She would not let this child feel that. Not tonight. Not while she was in her arms. Across half the city, in a mansion set deep in the North Shore, where iron fences 3 meters high and security cameras stood in for curious neighbors, Dominic Corsetti sat at the head of a black oak conference table and listened while the most powerful men in his empire delivered reports on their latest failures. The conference room had been designed to impress and intimidate, with its high ceiling and crystal chandelier, mahogany-paneled walls, and valuable oil paintings framed in gold leaf. Yet nothing in that room was as frightening as the man seated at its center. At 36 years old, Dominic Corsetti had inherited and expanded the empire his father built, turning the Corsetti family from one of many forces in Chicago into the only one that truly mattered. He stood well over 1 meter 80 tall, with broad shoulders and a body carved by iron discipline, black hair cut short and neat, and gray eyes as cold as winter on Lake Michigan. His face was all sharp planes and angles, sculpted into something that showed no emotion at all as he listened to each capo report in turn. "Nothing," one of them said, his voice stretched tight with fear he could not quite hide. They had checked every warehouse on the south side, every safe apartment Falcone had ever used. There was no sign of the boy. Dominic didn't speak, didn't nod, didn't frown. He only looked at the man with a blankness so absolute it was more terrifying than any outburst of rage. The next report came in a shaking voice. Details about street-level informants who had been questioned, about snitches who had been squeezed, about small-time criminals who had been asked the sort of questions no one wanted to describe out loud. Every lead had dead-ended. Every trail had gone cold. 3 weeks. 21 days since Dominic's world had burned itself down to ash, and every day without news was another day something inside him died a little more. The memory of that night stayed sharp in his mind, like a blade drawn across bare skin, refusing to dull no matter how hard he tried to shove it down. He remembered the phone call at 3 in the morning, Marco's voice shaking for the first time in 10 years of knowing him. He remembered driving through the Chicago darkness at a speed that could have killed a man, his heart pounding against his ribs as if it meant to break free. He remembered Sophia's apartment door hanging broken, hinges twisted and splinters of wood scattered across the floor. And he remembered the blood, so much blood on the white tile of the living room, dark and thick under the harsh fluorescent light. Sophia lay there, his little sister, the baby he had once held when she was only a few hours old, the girl he had sworn to protect with his own life. Her eyes stared up at the ceiling, empty and unseeing, and Dominic knew even before he knelt to feel for a pulse that she was gone. There were signs of a struggle, her nails broken with traces of blood beneath them, bruises on her arms where she had fought back. Sophia had not gone quietly. His sister had never been the kind to surrender, not even to death, but it was not her body that had dragged a raw animal scream out of Dominic that night. It was the empty crib in the next room. Luca, his nephew, the 5-month-old boy with his mother's eyes and a crescent-shaped port wine birthmark on his neck, was gone. There was no trace of the baby's blood, no signs of violence in the nursery, only the terrible emptiness where the crib stood, and the absence of the pale blue blanket embroidered with white stars that Sophia had knitted herself throughout her pregnancy. Someone had murdered his sister and stolen his nephew, and Dominic would burn this city to the ground to find out who it was. For the past 3 weeks, he had done his best to make good on that vow. Every source the Corsetti family had ever cultivated had been called in. Every debt had been collected. Every possible enemy had been questioned with methods that made even hardened criminals shake. Dominic had gone himself into the basement of a warehouse on the west side to speak with a human trafficker suspected of involvement, and when he came back upstairs 3 hours later with blood on his hands and no answers, the man below was no longer in any state to talk to anyone. No matter how many men Dominic tortured, no matter how many he killed, No matter how many rival operations he set on fire, Luca seemed to have vanished from the surface of the earth. Every lead collapsed into nothing. Every stream of information dried up, and with each day that passed, the hope of finding Luca alive grew thinner and more fragile. Victor Falcone, Dominic thought. As the meeting went on around him like a wash of sound, he no longer bothered to separate into words. That name appeared in every investigation. The old enemy of the Corsetti family. The man who had killed Dominic's father 11 years ago and had never stopped hungering for the complete erasure of the Corsetti bloodline. Even with that certainty burning in his chest that Falcone was behind all of this, Dominic could not find proof, could not locate the place where Luca was being held, could not reach his enemy in any way that mattered. He was failing. For the first time in his life, Dominic Corsetti was failing at the one thing that mattered most. The conference room door flew open with a crash that cut every conversation short in a single heartbeat. Marco Vitali stood in the doorway, breathing hard, his eyes lit with something Dominic didn't dare to name. In 12 years of service to the Corsetti family, Marco had never entered a room without knocking first, never broken the unwritten code of ceremony that everyone in the organization treated as holy law. That breach of protocol sent a taut jolt of tension through the room, hands drifting by instinct toward the weapons hidden beneath dark suit jackets. Dominic was different. He saw something in Marco's eyes, something he had not allowed himself to hope for in 3 long weeks, and his heart slammed once, painfully, inside his chest. Marco didn't wait to be invited. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, a tablet already glowing in his hand, and his voice shook with contained urgency as he spoke the words Dominic had thought he would never hear again. They might have found Luca. Dominic didn't remember giving the order for everyone else to leave, didn't remember how the others slipped out and closed the door behind them. All he knew was that a moment later he was alone with Marco, watching a security video play on the tablet screen, footage from a convenience store on the south side of the city, the timestamp showing it was taken the night before, only a few hours ago. Dominic watched the screen with a focused intensity that could have burned straight through the glass. 3 masked men stormed into the store, guns raised in every direction, customers dropping to the floor in a blur of panic. His eyes swept over the faces caught on camera, searching, hunting, until he saw her. A small woman in medical scrubs, dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail, lying on the floor near a row of shelves. But it was not the woman herself that made Dominic's heart go still. It was what she held. A baby. Someone had shoved the child into the arms of the woman in scrubs. And when the gunshots exploded through the store and the owner crumpled into a pool of blood, that woman did something Dominic knew he would never forget. She curled her body around the baby, turning herself into a shield, hiding the child from the storm of violence without even a second of hesitation. She was a complete stranger, a woman with no reason at all to risk her life for a child that was not her own, yet she did it by instinct, as naturally as if there had never been any other choice. Marco enlarged the image, and Dominic stopped breathing. The camera angle caught the baby's neck clearly, and there, as unmistakable as it had been the first day Dominic saw it in the hospital when Luca was born, was the crescent-shaped port wine mark. The blanket wrapped around the baby slipped into the frame as the woman shifted her grip. A pale blue fabric scattered with small white stars. The same blanket Sophia had spent the final month of her pregnancy knitting stitch by careful stitch, pouring all her love into every loop of yarn. Luca, his nephew, alive. Dominic had no idea how long he stood there, staring at the screen where the image had frozen on the moment the unknown woman tucked the baby against her chest. Something inside him, some part that had gone numb and dead on the night he found Sophia, began to thaw with a pain so fierce he had to brace his hand on the table to stay upright. Relief crashed through him like a dam breaking, so powerful it left him breathless, and he realized his eyes were burning with tears he had not allowed himself to shed in 3 endless weeks. Luca lived. The baby lived. He could not save Sophia. But Luca was still here, still breathing in this world, and someone had protected his nephew when Dominic could not. He played the video again, slower this time, unable to tear his gaze away from the woman in scrubs. The way she held Luca, steady but gentle. The way her mouth moved as she clearly sang or hummed something to soothe him, though the footage had no sound. The way she examined the baby with the careful precision of someone trained, right after the gunman fled. The way she refused to let go of him even when the police arrived, even when a social worker tried to take the baby from her arms. Gratitude was the first emotion Dominic could name, deep and primal enough to bring him almost to his knees. This stranger had done what his entire empire had failed to do in 3 weeks. She had kept Luca safe. But there was another feeling too, something he didn't want to look at closely as he zoomed in on her face. noting the soft lines of her features, the steady eyes that held their ground even though she was clearly afraid, the way she looked down at Luca as if he were the most precious thing on earth. Attraction. Dangerous. Ill-timed. Dominic buried that flicker of awareness in the coldest part of himself and turned to Marco with his familiar steel back in place in his gaze. Find out who she is. Right now. It took Marco less than 2 hours to gather everything they needed, because the Corsetti Empire had eyes and ears in every corner of the city, from the police department to the hospitals, from the courts to the social services offices. And Dominic sat in his private office, a room even his capos were rarely invited into, listening to the report with the unblinking focus of a predator on the hunt. Olivia Mercer. Marco read from the tablet, 27 years old, a pediatric nurse at Mercy General Hospital, with 6 years of experience and a spotless professional record. But it was not that part that made Dominic pause. It was what came next. Orphaned at 7 when her alcoholic father died, and her mother, who had left when Olivia was 3, never returned. She had gone into the foster care system and been moved through 8 different foster homes over 11 years until she aged out of the system. No family, no relatives, only one roommate named Mia Wong who tended bar at a downtown place, the two of them sharing a small apartment in Lincoln Park on the 4th floor of a walk-up where the rent swallowed nearly half of Olivia's monthly paycheck. And most important of all, she had convinced social services to let her serve as an emergency foster placement for the baby found in the robbery, using her nursing credentials and pediatric experience as leverage. Dominic asked for more footage, and Marco had it ready. A police station camera showed Olivia sitting in a plastic chair with Luca in her arms, refusing to hand the baby over when he screamed at the social worker's touch. Another camera in the lobby of her apartment building caught her coming in close to midnight with a car seat and a bag of donated supplies, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion but her steps still careful, as if she were carrying the most precious thing in the world. There was more footage shot through the apartment window by one of Marco's men who had been sent out the moment they had a lead, showing Olivia feeding Luca from a bottle at 2 a.m, her face drawn with fatigue yet soft and tender in the warm yellow light of the small room. Dominic studied every frame, every tiny movement, the way Olivia tucked Luca against her chest while she fed him, the way she tested the milk on the inside of her wrist before offering the bottle, the way she patted his back afterward to coax out a burp with the easy skill of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Every gesture spoke of professional care layered with something deeper, something personal and instinctive that no textbook could teach. She does not know who she is holding, Dominic said, his voice low and slow as if he were thinking out loud. She thinks he is just a baby abandoned in a robbery, not the nephew of one of the most powerful families in Chicago. Marco nodded and added that, according to her statement at the station, Olivia knew nothing about the woman who had handed her the baby, nothing about where the child came from, and she had no ties at all to the underworld or to the Falcone family. She is clean, Marco concluded. So clean it is almost impossible to suspect her of anything. Just an orphan nurse living month to month with nothing but her job in a cramped apartment, and somehow fate had dropped the nephew of Dominic Corsetti into her arms in the middle of a random convenience store heist. Dominic rose and reached for his coat. "I am going to see her," he said, and it was not a question or a suggestion, but a simple statement of fact. Marco hesitated for the briefest moment before speaking, his tone careful, like a man stepping onto thin ice, and suggested that perhaps someone else should go first, to assess the situation, to make sure this was not some elaborate trap Falcone had set. Dominic turned back to him with a stare that didn't allow for dissent. "That is my nephew," he said, each word weighted and final like granite. "I am not sending anyone else to claim Luca. I am going myself." Marco understood the discussion was over, and bowed his head in acceptance, already moving to arrange the escort and the convoy for the trip. Dominic glanced once more at the tablet screen, at the frozen image of Olivia Mercer cradling Luca, and wondered if this orphan girl had any idea that her life was about to change forever. Morning sunlight poured through the thin curtains of the apartment, while Olivia sat in the old armchair feeding the baby his first bottle of the day, Mia having already left for work after scribbling a note on the kitchen table saying she would bring dinner home and that Olivia needed more sleep because she looked like the walking dead. Olivia had smiled tiredly when she read it, because Mia was not wrong. She had only slept a few hours, waking at every rustle and tiny sound the baby made. Nurse's training and protective instinct tangled together until real sleep felt impossible. The baby drank with lazy satisfaction, big dark eyes gazing up at her with that absolute trust only an infant can give. And in her mind Olivia had begun to call him Little One, not daring to give him any real name because she knew this was only temporary, knew that somewhere out there might be a family searching for this child, a mother somewhere already drowning in regret for having run away in panic. Yet with every hour that passed with no news, every moment the baby clung to her as if she were his entire world, it became harder for Olivia to remind herself that this was not her child, that she was only a temporary guardian. A knock sounded on the door, 3 firm, even raps. Olivia set the bottle down and rose with the baby still in her arms, assuming it was the social worker coming for a scheduled check-in, or perhaps the police with an update on the woman from the night before. She walked to the door and opened it without peeking through the peephole, a mistake she would later understand had changed the entire course of her life. The man on the other side was not a social worker. He stood well over 1.80 meters, broad-shouldered, power-coiled and contained beneath a black suit tailored so perfectly it probably cost more than 6 months of her rent. His black hair was cut short and neat, his features carved sharp as if from stone, and his gray eyes were as cold as winter as they fixed on her with a focused intensity that made Olivia feel pinned in place. Behind him, 2 other men stood silent and solid, their shoulders wide, arms folded, eyes sweeping the hallway with the wariness of trained bodyguards, which was exactly what Olivia's mind supplied in a quick flash of awareness. And along with that realization came the first thin wave of fear tracing a chill line down her spine. "You are holding my nephew," the man said, his voice deep and even, not a question but a declaration, and Olivia felt the blood drain from her face in that instant. She stepped back automatically, her arms tightening around the baby as if someone were already trying to pull him away. Sensing the tension, the child squirmed, a small cry starting in his throat. The man crossed the threshold without waiting for an invitation, and Olivia kept retreating until her back bumped against the edge of the dining table, the small apartment suddenly feeling cramped and airless under the sheer force of his presence, as if he were swallowing all the oxygen in the room simply by being there. Then he really saw the baby, truly saw him for the first time since stepping inside, and something changed. The ice in his gray eyes cracked for a single heartbeat, revealing something beneath that Olivia could hardly believe she was seeing there at all. Raw pain, wild relief, aching longing. The granite mask of his face fractured for that 1 second before he dragged his control back into place. But 1 second was enough. Olivia noticed the way he swallowed hard, the way his jaw clenched, the slight tremor in his hand as he lifted it as if to touch the child and then stopped halfway, fingers curling tight at his side. This was not how a kidnapper or a criminal intent on stealing a child reacted. This was how a man who had lost someone and had just found them again looked. "Luca," he whispered, and the name slipped from his mouth like a prayer, full of pain and reverence. Standing there with the baby in her arms, her back pressed to the table edge, watching this stranger look at the child she had spent the night protecting, as if he were salvation itself, Olivia understood that everything she thought she knew about this situation was wrong. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt, because 6 years in a pediatric emergency department had taught her how to sound calm while chaos raged inside. "And how do I know you are telling the truth?" The man tore his gaze away from the baby and looked at her. Really looked at her as if he were only now noticing that she occupied the same space, and in those cold gray eyes Olivia saw something that frightened her more than any spoken threat. He looked at her as if he were measuring her, weighing her, as if he were quietly deciding her fate. And whatever that decision turned out to be, Olivia knew with a bone-deep certainty that her life would never be ordinary again. "I will not hand this baby over to anyone until I have proof," Olivia heard her own voice say, steady and clear, even though inside her a storm of panic was screaming at her to keep quiet and do whatever this man demanded. And the man stopped, and for one brief instant his expression was pure astonishment, as if she had just spoken in a language he didn't understand, because it was obvious he was not a man accustomed to refusal, not a man used to anyone standing between him and what he wanted, and Olivia wondered what she was doing, wondered who she was challenging, but she could not do anything else. Not when the baby in her arms clung to her shirt with absolute trust, not when she had promised herself she would protect this child, and he watched her for a long moment, gray eyes moving over her face as if he were reading an important document. And then something she didn't expect happened. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile but something that felt very close to respect, and he said, "My name is Dominic Corsetti," and Olivia felt the blood ice in her veins when that surname reached her ears. Corsetti, she didn't have to follow crime reports to know that name. Anyone living in Chicago knew the Corsetti family, the shadow empire that controlled half the city, the name whispered in fear in neighborhood bars, and printed on front pages every time something violent erupted in the underworld. And now Olivia was standing in her tiny apartment face to face with the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago and refusing to give him what he wanted. And she was fairly sure this was how she was going to die, but she didn't take another step back, didn't tremble, didn't beg. She only stood there holding the baby and waited. And Dominic began to speak, his deep voice even and low as he told a story in which every word seemed to drop into the room with the weight of stone, about Sofia Corsetti, his youngest sister, 28 years old, murdered in her apartment 3 weeks earlier, the killer taking her 5-month-old son Luca as leverage against the Corsetti family, or perhaps simply as another way to cause pain. 3 weeks of searching that led nowhere. 3 weeks of hell, until the footage from the convenience store the night before showed a baby with a crescent-shaped birthmark on his neck, and a pale blue blanket with white stars that Sofia had knitted herself, and Olivia listened even as everything inside her shouted that this could be a trap, a lie, anything at all. Yet she saw the truth in this man's eyes, because she had seen more than enough pain in 6 years as a pediatric nurse to recognize real loss when someone spoke of it. And Dominic Corsetti, the terrifying mafia king whose name made an entire city shudder, was looking at the baby in her arms with the eyes of a man crushed by grief. "And I need proof," Olivia repeated, her voice softer than before but still unshaken. "I need to be certain before I give this baby to anyone." And Dominic didn't explode in anger as she had feared. Instead, he nodded once, slowly, and took a phone from the pocket of his suit, his fingers moving across the screen before he held it out to her. And Olivia's heart twisted when she saw the image there. A young woman with long dark hair and a radiant smile holding a newborn, her face overflowing with joy and love, the baby in the photo smaller, only a few weeks old. But the mark on his neck was already clearly visible, a wine-colored crescent moon. "Sofia and Luca," Dominic said, his voice going a little rough as he looked at the picture, 2 weeks after my nephew was born, and he swiped to the next image. A birth certificate in the name of Luca Corsetti, with Sofia Corsetti, listed as mother, and the space for father left blank, and then another image, the pale blue blanket with white stars spread out on a table clearly arranged for a photograph, a note beneath it saying Sofia had spent 3 months knitting it, and Olivia looked down at the baby in her arms, at the crescent-shaped mark on his neck, at the same blue blanket she had wrapped around him again after his bath the night before, and everything matched, every last detail, and she understood that she was holding the nephew of the Chicago Mafia boss, the child kidnapped after his mother was murdered, the child an entire criminal empire had been searching for during 3 long weeks, and she had simply caught him in her arms in the middle of a random robbery, and Olivia's chest ached as she looked at the tiny face turned up to her with unconditional trust, because little one was not an abandoned baby at all. He had a name, Luca, he had a family, and now she had to give him back to where he belonged, whatever that might mean in the world of blood and shadows ruled by the Corsetti family. And Dominic stepped closer to her and the baby, and Luca's reaction was immediate. He started to cry, a thin wail of fear and unfamiliarity, his small body curling in on itself as he burrowed deeper against Olivia's chest, as if trying to hide from the man approaching. And Dominic stopped as if someone had struck him, pain flashing across his face so quickly that Olivia almost thought she had imagined it, that his nephew, the child he had been hunting for 3 weeks, the baby he would have set the city on fire to reclaim, was screaming when he came near, and instinctively Olivia lifted her hand and rubbed Luca's back, murmuring soft nonsense sounds to soothe him, and as if by magic the crying eased into hiccups and then faded away, Luca lifting his tear-damp eyes to her and then smiling, that gummy baby smile reserved only for the person a child trusts most in the world. And Dominic stood there watching, and Olivia could almost see the gears turning behind his eyes, could almost hear the cold, precise calculations of a man used to making decisions that meant life or death. And when he finally spoke, the words were so unexpected that Olivia was sure she had misheard. "You are coming with us," he said. Not a question, and not an invitation, but a simple decree. And Olivia felt as if she had been thrown against a wall, shaking her head before she could think, the words spilling out of her like reflex. "I can't," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I have a job. I have a shift tomorrow. I have a life here. I helped you find your nephew, but I can't just walk away from everything." And Dominic watched her with a gaze that didn't waver, and Olivia realized with a shiver that he was not a man familiar with the phrase "can't" from anyone. "Miss Mercer," he said, his deep voice slow and careful as if he were explaining something to a child. "My nephew was taken by the same people who murdered my sister. For 3 weeks they kept Luca somewhere, and he didn't escape by chance. The woman in the store was Elena, the wife of one of Falcone's guards. She couldn't stomach what they were planning for the boy, so she stole him to save his life. But Falcone's men were hunting her. She knew she was a walking dead woman when she entered that store. She gave Luca to you because she knew she wouldn't survive the night. And she was right. They found her body 2 hours ago. He paused just long enough for the horror of his words to sink in before continuing. Those people, the Falcone family, will not stop. When they learn that Luca is alive and has been found, they will try to finish what they started. And you, the woman seen on security cameras holding my nephew, the woman who gave a statement to the police and left your name and address, do you really think they will simply ignore you? And Olivia felt the blood drain from her face as the meaning of his words settled around her like ice, because she had imagined that once she returned Luca to his family, she would slip back into her ordinary life of 12-hour shifts and the small apartment and quiet evenings with Mia. She had not realized that by simply taking a strange baby into her arms in the middle of a robbery, she had stepped into the crosshairs of a mafia war she had never even known existed. They will come here, Dominic went on, his tone stripped of pity because the truth didn't require softness. Perhaps not today and perhaps not tomorrow, but they will come. And when they do, this little apartment will not protect you. Your nursing job will not protect you. Nothing in your normal life will protect you from what the Falcone family is willing to do in order to take revenge. And Olivia looked down at Luca, at the child gripping her finger with unthinking trust, and she understood that she no longer had any real choice. She could stay and wait to die, or she could follow this man into a world she didn't understand, a world of blood and darkness and rules that made no sense to her. And Luca needs you, Dominic added, his voice softening slightly as he glanced at the way the baby clung to her. You saw it yourself. My nephew will not let me near him. These 3 weeks have done something to him, made him afraid of strangers, afraid of men. But he trusts you. He needs you, at least until he can adjust to his own family. And that was the real reason. Olivia realized, not only that she was in danger, but that Luca required her. And Dominic Corsetti, cold, ruthless mafia boss, was bowing to the needs of a 5-month-old child. You have 10 minutes to pack, he said, then turned and walked toward the door as if everything had already been decided. We will be waiting downstairs, and the door closed behind him and the 2 bodyguards, leaving Olivia standing alone in the familiar clutter of her apartment, holding a stranger's baby as she understood that the life she thought she knew had ended 10 minutes earlier and she had not even noticed it happening. Olivia packed her life in a little less than 10 minutes, and the saddest part was how little there actually was to take. A small suitcase with a few changes of clothes, her toiletries, and a box that held the only things she refused to leave behind, a handful of old faded photographs of Lily, the simple thread bracelet her foster sister had woven for her before she died, and the nursing diploma she had worked 2 jobs for 4 long years to earn, all she owned after 27 years on this earth fitting neatly into 1 suitcase and 1 bag. And she called the hospital first, her voice surprisingly calm as she explained she needed emergency leave for family reasons, that she didn't know for how long but would be in touch when she could. The shift supervisor clearly displeased but forced to agree because Olivia's 6-year record was flawless. No fake sick days, no late arrivals, nothing but steady reliability. And then she texted Mia, her fingers shaking as she tapped out each word. Something happened. The baby has a family. They came for him. I have to go away for a while. Do not worry about me. I will explain later. Love you, Mia. And she had no idea how to say anything more. No idea how to put into a message that she was about to follow a mafia boss to his mansion because of a baby she had known for less than 24 hours. And because someone now wanted her dead, some things simply could not be reduced to a text on a screen. And when she looked around the tiny apartment one last time, memory rose up on her like a tide. Uninvited and unstoppable, the last time she had walked away like this she had been 17. Moving from her final foster home into a shabby dorm room she paid for with wages from a fast food job, she remembered that feeling, the sense of stuffing an entire existence into a single bag, the sense of belonging nowhere, of being pushed from place to place by decisions other people made, and she had believed she had escaped that life, believed she had built something stable and truly hers. But now, as she stared at the small suitcase by her feet and the sleeping baby in her arms, Olivia understood she was repeating the same pattern all over again. Only this time the person making the decisions had steel-gray eyes and a criminal empire at his back, and Dominic was waiting by a sleek black sport utility vehicle when she came down the stairs with Luca in her arms and the suitcase rolling behind her, saying nothing as she approached, only nodding for one of the bodyguards to take her luggage before he opened the rear door. And Olivia climbed in while Dominic slid in from the other side. Luca settled between them in a car seat someone had already installed, the baby fast asleep, oblivious to the fact that the world around him had split open and rearranged itself. And Olivia envied that unknowing peace as the car rolled through the morning streets of Chicago, and she watched the familiar city slide past the window as if she were seeing it for the last time. And perhaps she was, at least the version of the city in which she had been nothing more than an ordinary nurse with an ordinary life. The car turning toward the North Shore, where the scenery shifted from crowded apartment buildings to large houses hidden behind high fences and thick trees, until they stopped before a massive iron gate, bristling with cameras and guarded by men with watchful eyes. And Olivia understood she was crossing into an entirely different world, the gate swinging open, and the vehicle gliding along a long curve of gravel drive between manicured lawns and perfectly clipped flower beds, until it halted in front of a mansion she would once have expected to see only in films. And they led her inside through wide corridors of marble floors and expensive oil paintings, up a staircase, and down a hall to a room someone announced as hers, a room larger than the apartment she had just left behind, with a king-size bed, an oak wardrobe, and windows looking out over the gardens, a connecting door opening into the next room, where a fully stocked nursery waited, clearly prepared for Luca. Beautiful, Olivia thought as she looked around, luxurious and immaculate, and utterly like a gilded prison. The first days in the Corsetti mansion passed like a strange dream, from which she was not sure she wanted to wake, and she spent most of her time in the nursery with Luca, caring for him on a schedule she created for herself, as if this were just another job, and not the utterly surreal situation life had thrown her into. Feeding him, changing him, bathing him, rocking him to sleep, those familiar tasks the only solid ground under her feet in a world that had tilted sideways. And Luca was recovering. She could see it in the way he began to gain weight, in the healthier color of his skin, in the smiles that bloomed more often on his small face. Yet he still clung to her as if he were a shadow stitched to her body, still cried whenever she moved too far from his line of sight, still tensed and curled in on himself when anyone unfamiliar came too close. 3 weeks of captivity had left an invisible scar on the fragile mind of a 5-month-old child, and Olivia wondered if those scars would ever truly fade. And she watched this new world with the wary attention of someone trying to decode a language entirely foreign, the mansion functioning like a private kingdom, with its own unwritten rules, men in dark suits, moving through the halls with stern faces, closed-door meetings in Dominic's office, dark vehicles arriving and leaving at all hours, no one bothering to explain anything to her and she not asking, understanding instinctively that there were things it was better not to know if she ever wanted to close her eyes at night and rest. And it was Marco Vitale who first spoke to her in more than the few words necessary to keep the household running, appearing on the 3rd day while she fed Luca in the small breakfast room the staff had told her she could use, sitting down across from her without asking permission, setting a cup of coffee on the table and studying her with eyes that assessed but didn't threaten. "You are doing well," he said in his deep, even voice. "Luca looks much better than he did when we first saw the footage," and Olivia had no idea how to respond. So she simply nodded and kept feeding the baby as silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but heavy, until Marco spoke again, his tone softening a fraction. "Sophia would have liked you," he said, and the name made Olivia look up. He went on to say that Sophia had been the light in this place, that when she was alive the house had not felt as cold as it did now, that she had a way of making everyone laugh, even Dominic, even in the darkest times, his gaze drifting to the window as if he could see her there in the garden. And he said Sophia had been unlike anyone else in the family, that she believed in goodness, in love, in the possibility of redemption for everyone, and that Dominic had done everything he could to shield her from the darker parts of their world, to keep her pure and safe. But in the end the darkness had come for her anyway, and then he rose and left before Olivia could form any answer, their brief conversation cracking open a door in her mind, giving her a glimpse of the people behind the frightening reputation. And slowly she began to watch Dominic with different eyes, seeing the way he moved through his days as the ruthless boss the city feared, his presence in the house an icy center of authority as he issued orders that brooked no argument, disappeared into meetings that lasted for hours, returned with his shoulders slightly bowed and his eyes darker than before, hardly ever appearing in the nursery during daylight, perhaps because Luca still cried whenever he came too near, and Olivia could see how that cut into him even as he hid it. But at night he was someone else. And on the 4th night in the mansion, Olivia woke around 2 a.m. to the soft sound of Luca's cry, slipping out of bed to go to the nursery and freezing, When she opened her door and saw him standing there in the dim hallway, Dominic motionless in the shadows just outside the nursery, not stepping inside, only watching through the narrow gap of the partially open door, the moonlight from the hall window brushing over his face and revealing what he hid so carefully during the day. Beneath that granite mask, raw grief, suffocating guilt, aching longing, the pain of a man who had lost his sister and almost lost his nephew, who blamed himself for failing to protect them, who could only stand on the far side of the threshold and look at the child sleeping inside because the child cried whenever he drew closer. And Olivia slipped back into her room before he sensed her presence. But the image branded itself into her mind and refused to fade. The terrifying Mafia king of Chicago harboring a heart shattered beneath his armor of iron, and somehow knowing that made everything between them infinitely more complicated. Dominic sat in his private office at 3 a.m, the desk lamp the only pool of light in the darkened room, and read through the file on Olivia Mercer for the 4th time, as if the words might change if he stared at them long enough. The first time he had read it, he had been hunting for a threat, trying to decide whether she was a Falcone spy. The second time, he had been trying to understand who she was. By the third and the fourth, he no longer knew why he kept turning the pages, only that he could not seem to stop. Olivia Grace Mercer, born in Chicago 27 years ago. A mother who walked away when her daughter was 3 and never once looked back. A father who drank himself to death, his liver failing when she was 7, leaving her alone in an empty house until the neighbors called the police because of the smell of rotting food and the sound of a child crying. 8 foster homes in 11 years, each move another rejection, another reminder that she didn't truly belong anywhere. The 5th family. A note from a social worker mentioning signs of emotional abuse and possibly physical as well, but not enough evidence to press charges. Lily Chen, the foster sister in the 6th home, the only person Olivia ever truly attached to, dead from leukemia at 16 after the insurance system refused to cover an expensive treatment for an orphan no one cared about. Dominic set the file down and looked toward the window, where the Chicago night sky glowed with the scattered lights of a city that never really slept. He had seen a great many tragedies in his life, had been the author of more than a few, but something about Olivia's story lodged under his skin in a way he could not shrug off. Perhaps it was because she had walked through hell and somehow had not become a monster, had not grown bitter or cruel the way he had. Instead, she had become a nurse, had given her life to caring for sick children, defending the small and fragile, as if she were continually trying to save the younger version of herself who had once cried alone in a silent house. She was strong, Dominic realized, but in a way that was the opposite of his. He was strong by building walls, by becoming the kind of man no one dared to touch, by turning his pain into ruthlessness. Olivia was strong by refusing to let pain turn her into someone else, by holding on to gentleness in a world that had given her every excuse to harden. He wondered how much courage that took, and understood it was perhaps more than he possessed. He thought of the way she cared for Luca, the unshakable devotion, the way she sang lullabies when she believed no one was listening, the way she put the needs of that child above her own fear and uncertainty, and he thought of the moment she had stood in front of him in that tiny apartment, refusing to hand over Luca even though she knew exactly who he was, demanding proof as though death didn't frighten her. For the first time in many years, Dominic realized he was thinking about a woman for reasons that had nothing to do with business, strategy, alliances, or anything that touched his empire. He was thinking about Olivia because she was herself, because something in her tugged him toward a light he had abandoned long ago. It was dangerous, it was unacceptable, it was happening anyway, whether he wanted it to or not. The knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts, and Marco came in, his tense expression announcing bad news before he said a word. "Falcone knows," Marco said bluntly. "Our sources confirm that Victor has learned Luca is alive and here." Dominic rose to his feet, his body slipping back into the battle readiness he had lived inside for the past 3 weeks. "What else?" he asked, because he knew there was always more, there was always another piece waiting. "Nico," Marco said, his voice dropping. He swore to his father that he would finish what was left undone. He wants to prove himself to Victor, and Luca is the perfect target. Dominic felt the familiar fury ignite in his chest, cold and sharp as a knife. Nico Falcone, Victor's 30-year-old son, ruthless and reckless and hungry to prove himself worthy of inheriting his father's empire, had had a hand in Sophia's murder. Dominic knew it in his bones even without hard proof, and now the man wanted to kill Luca to complete the erasure of the Corsetti bloodline. "Double the security," Dominic ordered. "No one comes in or out without my explicit permission. And her," he paused for a heartbeat. "Olivia, She does not leave the grounds under any circumstances. Luca's fever began around 10 that night, and Olivia knew the moment her palm touched his forehead that it would be a long night. His temperature was 38.5 degrees, not high enough for panic, but high enough to demand careful watch, especially for a baby whose little body was still recovering from 3 weeks of neglect. She asked one of the household staff to bring warm water and cloths, refusing the offer to summon the family's private doctor because she knew she could manage this. 6 years in a pediatric emergency department had trained her for nights just like this. She sponged Luca's small body with the warm cloths, gave him a dose of infant acetaminophen, and paced the nursery with him in her arms while he cried with the weary distress of a sick child who only wanted comfort. His cries now were not the screams of terror from those first days, but the thin, exhausted sobs of a baby who felt awful and didn't understand why, and Olivia whispered soft nonsense in his ear, while her own heart hammered with a fear she could not quite name. She had cared for hundreds of sick children in her career, but none of them had ever scared her the way this one did. None of them had ever made her want so fiercely to do everything in her power to protect them, as Luca did. At 3 a.m, when she sat in the rocking chair with Luca, warm and limp but still restless in her arms, the nursery door opened and Dominic walked in. He still wore his suit, but his tie was gone, the collar of his shirt undone as if he too had not slept, and his gray eyes went straight to Luca with a worry he made no attempt to hide. "How is he?" he asked, his voice low and rough with lack of rest. "The fever is coming down," Olivia answered, surprised that he was here, surprised that he knew. Then she remembered who he was. This was Dominic Corsetti, the man who controlled every detail of his empire. Of course he knew the moment his nephew became ill, even if it was 3 a.m. Dominic stepped closer, and this time Luca didn't cry, perhaps too tired to protest, perhaps soothed by the dimness of the room, lit only by the small lamp on the dresser that softened all the edges. He sat down beside the rocking chair, close enough that Olivia could catch the faint scent of expensive cologne, tempered by something warm and undeniably male beneath it. "What can I do?" he asked, and she heard the helplessness threaded through his voice, the frustration of a man used to controlling everything who could not command a fever to leave a child's body. She pointed to the bowl of warm water and the folded cloth, told him he could dip the cloth and wring it out so she could cool Luca's forehead, and he obeyed without a single objection. They moved together in quiet rhythm, Dominic passing her the cloth, Olivia bathing Luca's flushed skin, a wordless cooperation that somehow fit. When Olivia needed to shift the baby because her arms ached, Dominic slid his hands in to support Luca's head and back, awkward but painstakingly careful, as if the child were made of glass. And a small miracle occurred. Luca didn't cry. He looked up at the man holding him with eyes clouded by fever and fatigue, then let his lashes fall and relaxed as though he had decided, just this once, to trust. Dominic froze for a heartbeat, staring down at his nephew with an expression Olivia could only call reverence, and she saw his eyes shine wetly in the soft lamplight before he blinked the moisture away. Near 5 a.m, Luca finally drifted into deep sleep, the fever reduced to a safe level, and Olivia laid him gently in the crib, relief washing through her like a tide. She was too weary to stand right away, so she slid down the wall to sit on the floor beside the crib, her back braced against the cool plaster, and Dominic lowered himself beside her without a word. The silence stretched, not sharp or awkward but easy, the kind that settles between two people who have just gone through something together. "Tell me about you," Dominic said after a long time, his voice so soft it was almost a whisper. "About your life." Olivia turned her head to look at him, and found him watching her with something in his eyes she could not quite read, and she wondered how much he had already learned, how many lines from the file he had memorized by now. But it was one thing to read about a life and another to hear it spoken, so she began to talk. She told him about her mother leaving, about her father dying, about 8 foster homes and the hollow ache of never really belonging. She told him about Lily, the foster sister with a smile like sunshine and a heart too big for the world, about the way she had died slowly in a hospital bed while the system looked on, indifferent. Her voice remained even, as if she were recounting someone else's memories, but her eyes held the deep seasoned sorrow of pain that had scarred over without ever truly healing. She didn't know when his hand had come to rest on hers, didn't know who had reached out first, only that when she stopped speaking and glanced down, his fingers were laced with hers, warm and solid, and utterly uncalculated. Neither of them pulled away, neither of them said a word about it. They simply sat there in the first thin light of dawn seeping through the nursery curtains, hand in hand, 2 broken souls who had somehow found each other in the middle of the darkness, and Olivia knew that something had shifted, that something had begun, that she was not sure she could stop. even if she wanted to. The next night, with Luca fully recovered and sleeping deeply in his crib, Dominic came to Olivia's room and knocked softly instead of walking in as if he owned everything the way he usually did. And when she opened the door, she saw him standing there with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, his face tired but somehow different, softer, as if the armor he wore all day had been taken off along with his tie, and he asked if they could talk. And Olivia realized it was the first time he had ever asked instead of commanded. They sat on the small balcony outside her room, looking out over the dark garden under the moonlight, while Dominic poured the wine in silence. And then he began to talk about Sophia, saying in a low, distant voice that Sophia had been born when he was 8, and from the first moment he saw her in their mother's arms he had sworn to protect her from everything ugly in the world, that their mother died when Sophia was 12 and their father was killed when she was 16, and he did everything he could to keep her away from the darkness of their world. Olivia listened quietly, sipping the wine and tasting the deep ripeness of the grapes on her tongue as he went on, telling her that Sophia was like their mother, bright and joyful and stubbornly believing in goodness in a way he never could, that she saw light where he saw only shadows, hope where he saw nothing but danger, that she wanted an ordinary life, wanted love and a family and all the things people in his world had no right to dream about, and that he had let her dream because he could not bring himself to take away the last thing that made her who she was. He paused and took a long swallow from his glass, and Olivia saw his hand tremble slightly when he set it down, before he said that Sophia had met a man, not someone from their world, just an ordinary architect she had met in a cafe, and how he had had the man investigated and found nothing suspicious, so he left them alone, because Sophia was happy, truly happy for the first time in years, and he had not wanted to destroy that. Then she got pregnant, Olivia said softly, not as a question but as understanding, and Dominic nodded, his jaw tightening, and told her that the man had run as soon as he learned she was expecting, disappearing as if he had never existed at all. No explanation, no message, just an empty apartment and a dead phone number, that Sophia had cried for a week but then gotten up as she always did, deciding she would raise the baby alone, deciding she would love that child enough for 2 people. He lifted his gaze to the night sky, and Olivia saw the moonlight reflected in eyes that were beginning to shine with unshed tears, as he told her that Sophia had given birth to Luca, with only him and Marco outside the delivery room, that she had called him at 2 a.m. when her labor started and he had driven like a madman to the hospital, and that when he saw Luca for the first time, when he saw the way Sophia looked at her son, he had sworn all over again that he would protect them both with his life. His voice began to fracture then, small cracks splintering the steel he had forged around his heart for so many years, as he said that he had failed, that on the night Marco called, when he drove to her apartment and saw Sophia lying on the floor in a pool of blood with her eyes wide open staring at the ceiling, he knew he had failed his sister, that he had promised to protect her and he had not. And though he didn't cry, his voice shook so badly that each word seemed torn out of his throat as he added that Luca was gone, that the crib was empty, that the blanket Sophia had knitted was gone too, that he had lost them both in a single night, and for the 3 weeks that followed he didn't know whether he was alive or dead, only that he had to find Luca, had to do something right for once in his life. There were no words big enough for a grief like that, no comfort that could possibly mend a wound so raw. So Olivia didn't try to offer any. She simply laid her hand on his arm, a small gesture in the depths of the night, and felt the muscles beneath his skin go rigid and then slowly loosen under that light touch. Dominic looked down at her hand on his sleeve, and when he lifted his gaze to her face, Olivia saw that in those gray eyes there was no terrifying Mafia king, only a man smashed open by loss, an older brother who had failed to save his sister, a soul drowning in darkness and reaching blindly for something solid to hold on to. And she understood, because she had been there too, had stood beside a hospital bed, and watched Lily slip away while she could do nothing, had blamed herself for not having enough money, enough power, enough anything to save the person she loved most. 2 broken souls recognized each other in that darkness, and the silence between them stopped being a gap and became a bridge. 3 nights after that conversation on the balcony, Olivia lay in bed staring up at the ceiling in the dark, unable to sleep though it was long past midnight, her mind spinning with thoughts she had no idea how to handle. Thoughts about Dominic, about the way he looked at her, about how his arm had felt beneath her hand, about how her heart beat faster every time he walked into a room. None of this was supposed to be happening. She was an orphan nurse from a cheap apartment building, and he was the Mafia boss who controlled half of Chicago. They came from worlds as far apart as night and day, and anything between them could only end in disaster. But her heart ignored her reasoning, and kept repeating his name like a song she could not stop listening to. She got up and pulled on a thin robe, deciding to go out into the garden and breathe the night air to clear her head. The Corsetti garden after dark felt like another world, quiet and mysterious under the silver wash of the moon, and Olivia followed the stone path, the scent of roses and jasmine drifting on the cool air, until she saw a figure standing by the fountain at the garden's center. Dominic, alone, looking down at the water where the moon was mirrored in ripples, his face wearing that look she had learned to read over the past weeks, the expression of a man wrestling with his own ghosts. She started to turn away, not wanting to intrude on his private moment, but he heard the sound of her footsteps and turned, their eyes meeting in the dim light, and instead of surprise or irritation, she saw something like relief in his gaze, as if he had already been waiting though he had not known for what. "You can't sleep either?" he asked, his voice low in the stillness. Olivia moved closer, standing beside him by the fountain and feeling the warmth of his body in the cold night air, and said there was too much in her head, then asked about him. Dominic gave a small, humorless laugh and told her he didn't sleep much, not since Sophia died, that every time he closed his eyes he saw her, saw the blood, saw the empty crib, so he came out here and looked at the moon and tried to remember how to breathe. The silence that followed was not heavy, but the quiet of two people who didn't need constant words to understand each other, until he asked suddenly what she feared most, turning to her with a focused intensity that made her want to step back but left her feet rooted where they were. And Olivia thought about all the fears she had carried her whole life, and answered truthfully that she was most afraid of being abandoned, afraid of loving someone and losing them, afraid of opening her heart only to be pierced straight through, that she had lost too many people, and had taught herself not to attach, not to care, not to let anyone close enough to hurt her. Until now, she added silently, but didn't say aloud. Dominic nodded slowly, as if she had spoken a language he understood in his bones, and when she asked what he feared, he fell quiet for a long moment, staring down at the faintly moving water before saying in a rough voice that he was afraid he was not worthy, afraid that no matter what he did, no matter what he built or how many people he protected, he would always be the monster people said he was, afraid that the darkness inside him would swallow anyone who came near. He turned to look at her then, and in the moonlight his gray eyes burned with something fierce and frightening and beautiful all at once, as he said that she made him want things he didn't think he deserved, that she made him want to believe there could be light even inside his darkness. Olivia's heart pounded so hard she was sure he could hear it. She ought to step away, say something to break the spell of the moment, shield herself the way she had done for 27 years. But instead she heard her own voice confess the truth she had tried to bury, that he scared her because she was beginning to care, and she didn't know how to care without being crushed when she lost what she loved. The silence that fell between them then felt as heavy as a promise and as fragile as a breath, and Dominic lifted his hand, slowly, giving her all the time in the world to move away, and laid his palm against her cheek. Her skin flared hot beneath his touch, and she didn't retreat, didn't flinch, only stood still and looked into the gray eyes, asking a wordless question. And then he kissed her, gently, tenderly, his mouth brushing hers as if she were something precious and easily broken, as if he were asking instead of taking. And Olivia, the woman who had built walls around her heart all her life, who had sworn never to let anyone come close, who feared loving more than she feared death, kissed him back. The kiss deepened, grew fiercer, and she felt as if she were falling and flying at the same time, as if every wall she had ever erected were cracking and crashing down and she no longer cared. And then Dominic's phone vibrated, slicing through the moment like an alarm bell. He pulled back, breathing hard, resting his forehead against hers for a heartbeat before taking out the phone. "Marco," he said, his voice rough as he answered, and Olivia watched his face change in an instant from softened to ice-cold steel as he listened to whatever Marco was saying. "Falcone is moving." 3 days had passed since the kiss in the garden, and Olivia had not seen Dominic even once. He had disappeared the moment Marco's call ended that night, only pausing long enough to tell her he had to go and that she had to stay inside the house, and then his figure had melted into the darkness, as if he had never stood there with his mouth still warm on hers. Marco explained briefly that Dominic was taking care of business, a phrase Olivia had learned meant do not ask for details, and she didn't. She simply took care of Luca, and tried not to think about the feel of Dominic's lips on her own, about the way her heart still sped up every time the memory slipped back in. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, she was feeding Luca in the nursery when the first gunshot cracked through the air. The sound tore through the quiet of the afternoon like a blade ripping cloth, sharp and sudden and completely wrong in a house like this. Olivia froze for a single heartbeat, the bottle slipping from her fingers and spilling across the floor. Before survival instinct took over and she gathered Luca tight against her chest. Then came the second shot, the third, a rapid staccato like fireworks from hell, and the mansion's alarm system began to howl, red lights flashing along the corridors like the eyes of something demonic. The nursery door flew open, and Marco stood there, his face drawn and a gun in his hand, something Olivia had never seen him carry inside the house before. "They are here," Marco said, his voice as hard as steel. "Come with me, now." It was not a request, not a suggestion, but a command that allowed no argument, and Olivia obeyed without thinking. She clutched Luca to her chest, covering his head with her hand, and ran after Marco out of the nursery. Luca began to cry, the high, terrified wail she had heard that night in the convenience store, and she wanted to stop and comfort him, but there was no time, no space for anything but running and praying. The mansion's long hallway had turned into a nightmare maze under the flashing red lights, and what she saw when they rounded the first corner nearly made her stumble. A bodyguard lay face down on the white marble floor, blood spreading from beneath him into a dark red pool, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling with the vacant gaze of someone who had left this world. Olivia swallowed back a rush of nausea and kept moving, shielding Luca's face so he would not see, even though he was too young to understand. The gunfire kept coming from somewhere deeper in the house, mixed with shouts and the crash of breaking glass, the sounds of violence and chaos she had only ever heard in movies and never imagined she would live through. Marco led her through a door she had never noticed before, into a narrower corridor, then stopped in front of what looked like an ordinary linen closet. He pushed aside a hidden panel, and a steel door appeared behind it, thick and heavy with a keypad mounted beside the handle. Marco punched in a code, and the door swung open to reveal a small room inside, lined with security monitors, satellite phones, and shelves of water and food. A panic room, Olivia realized. A last refuge designed for exactly this kind of moment. "Get inside," Marco said, guiding her gently through the opening. "Once this door closes, it can only be opened from inside, or with the code that only Dominic and I know. Do not open it for anyone but me or Dominic. Anyone else, no matter what they say, no matter what they threaten, you do not open this door. Understand?" Olivia nodded, her voice refusing to work as she managed to ask, "What about you?" Marco gave a smile that never touched his eyes. "I have work to do," he said, and in his tone Olivia heard something cold and deadly that she had never heard from him before. "They came into our home. They will pay for it." The steel door shut with a loud final thud, and Olivia was alone in the narrow room with Luca screaming in her arms. She turned to the monitors and saw images that looked like they belonged to someone else's nightmare. Men in black storming the mansion, exchanging fire with Corsetti security in the main hall, more bodies dropping on both sides. She saw Marco crossing one of the camera views at a run, gun in hand, vanishing into the fight. She saw flames beginning to lick along the east wing of the house. Someone had started a fire. Someone wanted to burn it all down. Olivia slid to the floor, her back pressed to the cold steel wall, cradling Luca against her while he cried, and she fought not to cry with him. The gunshots went on and on, sometimes so close she could feel the faint vibration through the walls, sometimes distant like thunder at the horizon. She had no idea how long it went on, no idea who was winning or losing, no idea where Dominic was or whether he even knew what was happening. All she knew was that she was shut inside a steel box with the child she had vowed to protect, while outside the door hell had opened its gates. Time lost all meaning in the windowless room, measured only by the pale glow of the security monitors and the way Luca's screaming slowly faded into exhausted hiccups. Olivia no longer knew how long it had been since Marco closed the door. It could have been 20 minutes. It could have been 2 hours, fear stretching every second until they all blurred into one shapeless mass. Her heart pounded like a hammer in her chest, each beat a reminder that she was still alive while people outside this room were dying. At last Luca wore himself out and drifted into a fitful sleep in her arms, his head resting in the hollow of her shoulder, with that absolute trust only a child can offer in the middle of danger. Olivia looked down at his small sleeping face and thought about the choices that had brought her here, about that night in the convenience store when she had wrapped herself around a stranger's baby in a hail of bullets, about her decision not to hand him to the system, about the car ride to this mansion, and the completely new life she had stepped into. In the dim safety of the panic room, memories rose without warning, dragging her backward to the last time she had been this afraid. 11 years earlier, in a public hospital that stank of disinfectant and fatigue, Lily lay in a bed surrounded by wires and machines, her skin pale and her eyes too tired to open. Olivia had sat beside her for the last 3 days, holding her hand and praying to a God she didn't believe in, begging for a miracle that never came. She remembered the moment Lily's heart stopped, the long flat tone of the monitor announcing that the end had come, remembered how she screamed for nurses and doctors, even though she knew there was nothing left to do, remembered the sensation of her sister's fingers growing cold in her own. She had sworn that night that she would never let herself love anyone deeply enough to be shattered like that again. But now, sitting in the dark with distant gunfire fading and no idea whether Dominic was alive or dead, Olivia understood she had broken that vow long ago without realizing it. She loved him. The truth was as simple and devastating as a shaft of light splitting the dark, impossible to deny or hide from. She loved Dominic Corsetti, the Mafia king with blood on his hands and a broken heart, the most dangerous man she had ever met, and the only one who had ever made her feel safe. She loved the way he looked at Luca when he thought no one was watching, loved the way his voice broke when he spoke of Sophia, loved the way he had kissed her in the garden as if she were something sacred. She was not supposed to love him. Every rational thought, every instinct for self-preservation screamed that this was madness, that his world would devour her, that she would be crushed all over again. But her heart didn't listen. Her heart only beat faster when she thought of him, and ached when she imagined him not coming back. She didn't want to lose anyone else. Not Luca, not Dominic, not this strange new family she had found in the last place she ever would have looked. The gunfire finally tapered off and silence fell, heavy and more frightening than the shots had been. Olivia held her breath, listening. And then she heard footsteps outside the door. Heavy, fast, coming closer. Her heart seemed to stop and then slam into overdrive. Marco had said only he and Dominic knew the code, but if they had lost, if someone had tortured the numbers out of them, if the door opened and Falcone stood there instead of the man she was waiting for. The faint beeps of fingers on the keypad, the sound of the lock turning. Olivia hugged Luca tight, bracing herself for the worst, and the door opened. Dominic stood there, outlined by the light from the corridor behind him, and Olivia didn't know when she had started crying, only that tears were already hot on her cheeks. His white shirt was soaked with blood, a cut on his forehead sending a thin line of red down his temple, his face drawn and exhausted and taut with strain but alive. He was alive, standing in front of her. His gray eyes found her in the dimness and relief broke across his features like sunrise after an endless night. He stepped into the room and Olivia pushed herself to her feet, still holding Luca, and then they were in each other's arms. Dominic wrapped her and the baby up against his chest as if he could shield them from the entire world. His embrace so tight it almost hurt, but Olivia didn't care. She only wanted to be closer, to press herself against the solid reality of him and feel his heart pounding through the blood-stiffened fabric, and know he was truly there. "You are safe," he whispered into her hair, his voice rough and unsteady. "You are safe now." And it was the first time he had ever called her you in that tender way, as if the word meant mine. 2 days after the attack, the Corsetti mansion wore the scars of battle like a soldier back from the front lines. The burned east wing had been sealed off. Bullet holes in the walls were covered with white cloth like bandages on open wounds, and the air still carried a faint taste of smoke and gunpowder, even though the staff had been scrubbing and washing night and day. 7 of the Corsetti men had fallen in the assault. 7 families who would receive generous compensation and the promise that their deaths would be avenged. The Falcone side had lost more. 13 bodies counted before the survivors pulled back, but the number didn't matter. No number would be enough until Victor Falcone and his son were in the ground. Dominic spent the entire day in meetings with his capos, maps and plans spread across the table, and Olivia saw him through the glass wall of his office as she passed with Luca in her arms, his face carved from stone, and his eyes burning with something dangerous and implacable. She didn't need anyone to explain to understand what was being prepared. That night, Dominic came to her room after Luca was asleep. He knocked softly, the way he had the last time, and when Olivia opened the door she saw him standing there with a weariness even his immaculate suit could not hide. The cut on his forehead had been stitched, leaving a thin red line that would become a scar, one more mark of the violent life he had chosen or had chosen for him. "May I come in?" he asked, and Olivia stepped back to let him pass, her heart beating faster no matter how hard she tried to keep it steady. They sat out on the balcony as they had the night he told her about Sophia, but there was no wine this time, only the moonlight and the heavy weight of unsaid words in the air. Dominic was silent for a long while, looking out over the dark garden, and when he finally spoke his voice was low and unhurried, as if each word heard on its way out. "Tomorrow," he said, "I am going to end this. Victor Falcone attacked my home, threatened my nephew, murdered my sister. That can't stand." Olivia nodded, not surprised. She had known this was coming from the moment she saw his eyes in the office that morning. She just had not expected him to come here and tell her himself. "When this is over," Dominic went on, his voice hardening as if he were building a wall around every syllable, "you are free to go. The threat will be gone. No one will come for you because of Luca anymore. You can go back to your ordinary life, back to the hospital, back to your apartment, back to everything you left behind." It felt like a fist drove into her chest, knocking the breath out of her. She turned to look at him and saw that he was not looking at her, his gaze fixed on the garden as if he could not quite face what she might say. "Are you sending me away?" she asked, her voice shaking more than she wanted it to. Dominic finally turned, and in his gray eyes she saw the pain he was trying so hard to hide. "I am giving you a choice," he said. "The choice you didn't have when I brought you here. You do not belong in this world, Olivia. You are good and clean and you take care of sick children instead of making a living by killing people. You deserve an ordinary life with an ordinary man, not the darkness and blood and danger that follow me like my own shadow." He paused, swallowed hard, and when he spoke again his voice broke like glass. "I love you. I do not know when it started. Maybe from the moment I saw you on that footage wrapping your body around Luca as if you were ready to die for a child who was not yours. I love the way you look at him. I love the way you stood up to me in that tiny apartment. I love that you didn't run even when you had every reason to. I love you, and because of that I have to let you go. Because you deserve better than me, better than this life, better than anything I can offer you." Silence fell between them, heavy and raw as an open wound. Olivia felt tears slide down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away, didn't hide, didn't care. She thought about everything he had just said, about the sacrifice in each word, about the way he was willing to break his own heart to set her free because he believed that was what was best for her. And she thought about her own life, about all the years she had spent alone, guarding her heart, refusing to let anyone close enough to hurt her. She thought about Lily and the promise she had made at that bedside, and she thought about the night in the panic room when she finally understood that she loved this man whether she should or not. "I am afraid of your world," she said at last, her voice trembling but sure. "I am afraid of blood and violence and doors kicked in at midnight. I am afraid that one day you will not come back and I will have to bury one more person I love." She reached up and laid her palm against his cheek, feeling the hard line of his jaw beneath his skin and the faint tremor he was trying to control. "But I am more afraid of losing you and Luca than of anything else on this earth. I have spent my whole life alone, building walls so high no one could get in, and I was safe. But safe is not the same as living. Lily told me that before she died, that living without loving is not really living at all. I didn't understand until I met you." She drew a deep breath and spoke the choice her heart had made long ago, long before her mind was willing to admit it. "I choose to stay. With you. With Luca. With all the darkness and danger and madness of this life. I choose to stay." Dominic kissed her after that declaration, a kiss deep and fierce, and filled with promises about a future they would build together if he survived the coming night. They didn't say much more, just sat side by side in the dark until dawn began to stain the horizon with pale pink. Then Dominic left to prepare for the final battle, and Olivia tried to sleep even though she knew sleep would not come. The next day dragged on under a suffocating tension, the mansion itself seeming to hold its breath and wait for the storm about to break. From her window, Olivia watched the black vehicles gather in the courtyard, men in body armor and heavy weapons moving with the precision of a well-trained army. She counted at least 20, and she knew there were more elsewhere, all of them poised for an assault that would decide the fate of 2 families. When sunset fell, Dominic came to the nursery where she sat with Luca in her arms. He had traded his suit for black body armor, his face cold and hard with the focus of a man about to walk into a fight where only one side would walk back out. But when he looked down at Luca, the armor cracked for a heartbeat, and the cool boss disappeared, leaving only an uncle staring at his nephew as if he were trying to burn the image into his memory in case this was the last time. Dominic bent and kissed Luca's forehead, his lips resting on the baby's soft skin for a long moment. "I will come back," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion he was barely holding in check. "I promise you." Then he straightened and turned to Olivia, gray eyes locking on hers with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. He lifted his hand and stroked her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her face as if memorizing it. "Wait for me," he said, and then he kissed her, brief but fierce, a promise sealed in the warmth of his mouth on hers. When he left, His footsteps were steady, even though Olivia knew he had to be shaking inside, and she stood at the window and watched the black convoy roll out through the gates, vanishing into the Chicago night like ghosts going on the hunt. And then she waited. That night was the longest of Olivia's life, longer than the nights in the hospital with Lily, longer than the nights she had cried herself to sleep in unfamiliar foster homes. She walked the nursery floor with Luca in her arms, from one window to the other, eyes straining into the darkness as if she could see him out there just by wanting it badly enough. Luca slept and woke and slept again, unaware of the war being fought somewhere in the city, unaware of the uncle who was risking his life to avenge his mother and protect his future. Olivia didn't pray often, didn't have much faith left after everything life had thrown at her, but that night she prayed. She prayed to anyone who might be listening, begged for his life, begged for his return, begged that she would not have to lose one more person she loved. The clock chimed the passing hours like a bell tolling toward judgment, and each hour without news was another turn of the screw. 3 in the morning, 4, 5. The sky began to shift from black to gray, dawn creeping in at the edges, and she could not tell whether that was a good sign or a bad one. Then she heard engines. Her heart stopped for a beat, and then took off at a frantic gallop as she ran to the window, with Luca still held tight against her. The line of black cars was coming back into the courtyard, fewer than had left, and fear tightened around her throat as she tried to count how many remained. She ran down the stairs, ignoring the way the guards stared at her, and burst out onto the front steps just as the lead vehicle came to a halt. The door opened, and Dominic stepped out. He looked like hell, his face bruised, his lower lip split, his body armor scuffed and scarred where bullets had hit and been stopped, his whole body dusted with grime and the bitter scent of gunpowder. But he was upright, he was breathing, he was alive. His eyes found hers instantly, and as they looked at each other across the courtyard in the first pale light of morning, Olivia saw what she had been searching for all night. "It is done," Dominic said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion, but steady with certainty. "Victor Falcone is no longer a threat." Olivia didn't ask for details, didn't ask how Nico had died or how many men had not come home. She simply walked to him with Luca safe between them, and when he pulled her into his arms she felt as if she could finally breathe again after a night spent drowning. "You are staying, yes," he whispered into her hair. And she heard the thread of vulnerability in the question, the fragile uncertainty of the most powerful man in Chicago asking the most important question of his life. "Always," she answered, and for the first time in a very long time she truly meant the word. 4 months after that fateful night, the nursery in the Corsetti mansion was full of autumn afternoon light, filtering through the thin cream curtains, laying warm golden stripes across the oak floor where Luca sat playing with the stuffed bear Marco had given him. At 9 months old, Luca was a completely different child from the thin, terrified baby Olivia had cradled during that convenience store robbery. He had been gaining weight steadily, cheeks round and rosy, eyes bright and shining with the quiet joy of a child who knows he is loved and safe. He laughed often now, a clear bell-like sound that filled the room every time Olivia pulled a silly face, or Dominic awkwardly tried to play peekaboo. On the wooden chest by the window, Sophia's photograph in a silver frame stood among fresh flowers that Olivia changed every week. Sometimes she spoke to Sophia on those late nights when she rocked Luca to sleep, telling the woman she had never met how her son was growing. About the first sounds he was trying to form, about the way he smiled just like his mother did in the old pictures. Olivia didn't know whether Sophia could hear her or not, but she liked to imagine that somewhere, somehow, the young mother was smiling to see her son so carefully cherished. On the small desk in Olivia's room, the official adoption papers rested in a glass frame beside her nursing diploma. Olivia Mercer, in the eyes of the law and in every way that mattered, was now Luca's mother. The paperwork had taken 2 months and more than a little of the Corsetti family's influence, but it was done. No one could take away the child she had loved from the first second he had been placed in her arms. Mia visited often now, hesitant at first in the face of the mansion's opulence and the stone-faced security, but these days comfortable enough to make her own coffee in the kitchen and call Marco by a teasing nickname. Their friendship had survived the violent upheaval of Olivia's life, and Mia was the thread that tied her back to the ordinary world she had once belonged to. Olivia no longer worked at Mercy General, but her nursing skills had found a new purpose. She cared for people in Dominic's world, the wounded who could not show up at a hospital without raising too many questions, the families who didn't trust the system but still needed someone who knew what they were doing. She had found her own way to live inside this darkness, bringing a small, stubborn light of healing into a place that had known mostly violence. Dominic's arm slid around her waist from behind, his warmth spreading through her back as he rested his chin on her shoulder, and watched with her while Luca crawled determinedly toward the stuffed bear in that earnest, wobbly way only babies have. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice low and warm against her ear. Olivia leaned her head back against him, smiling without turning. "For what?" "For picking up a stranger's baby in the middle of a robbery that night," Dominic said. "For not running when you learned whose nephew he was. For choosing to stay when you had every reason to walk away. For giving me a family when I thought I had lost everything." Olivia turned in his arms and set her hand over his chest, feeling his heart beating steady and strong beneath her palm. She thought of the path that had brought her here, from a tiny apartment and 12-hour shifts, through gunfire and fear, through strange days in a house that didn't feel like hers, and an endless night of waiting, to this moment of golden light, and Luca's laughter and the circle of the man she loved. "Family is not defined by blood or by rules," she said softly. "It is defined by choice. Choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. Choosing to love even when you know you might lose. I chose, and I will keep choosing, every day, for the rest of my life." The story of Olivia and Dominic had come to its close, but the lesson it left behind would go on echoing in each of our hearts. It was a lesson about courage, about daring to open your heart to love even when it has been broken before. It was a lesson about family, that true family is not merely the people who share your blood, but the ones who choose to stand beside you through every storm. And it was a lesson about healing, that even the most shattered souls can find one another and slowly build something new together out of the ruins. Dear friends, if this story has touched your heart, we would be grateful if you would subscribe to our channel, tap the like button, and share this video so we have the strength to bring you more moving stories every day. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel. Have you ever met someone who changed your life in an unexpected way? Do you believe that love can arrive in the most unlikely moments? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We are always honored to listen to the stories and reflections that come from the deepest part of your hearts. We wish every one of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with love. May you always find peace and happiness on your path. Thank you for spending your time with this story. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.